This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. We're fortunate tonight to have as our guest Mr. Thomas Raines, who heads the Frank M. Johnson Institute for Public Policy here in Montgomery, right around the corner from us. We filmed this show at the Rosa Parks building in downtown Montgomery, and some of y'all wonder where we filmed it because it's now on YouTube and everything else, but Thomas is my neighbor over here, and I was at an event, a portrait unveiling from my best friend Keith Watkins, who's been a U.S. federal judge here, right over here for about 20 years, and ran to Thomas over there, and I knew that Keith had been working on trying to get the Johnson Institute started, but I wasn't quite sure it was off and running. But he not only has it running, but got an outstanding gentleman running it and everything like that. So, Thomas, good to have you on the show.
It is good to be here. Thank you for having me, Steve.
We get old Keith to watch this show. He could have come down with you, but he's on sabbatical. But
sure.
Thomas, let's just begin and take as much time and be exact as you can. What is the Johnson Institute?
Sure.
I know you get
Sure.
asked that often. I bet you see somebody at a grocery store or a meeting and say, well, Thomas, what do you do?
That's right. So
They want to know, what is the Johnson Institute? So look, take a long time and tell how it started and what it does and its mission and everything.
I'd be happy to. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and our focus is on civics education and constitutional education. We work in partnership with the court over here, the Middle District of Alabama, right up the street in the courthouse. And our work focuses on three main areas. So Judge Keith Watkins was one of the ones who got us started when he was chief judge at the court, because there got to be such a growing number of visitors who wanted to come tour the courthouse that it got to be more than the court could do easily. And so we take that burden off the court. We have regular tour groups come through. This year we've had close to 1,000 visitors come through the courthouse since January 1. That is, last year we had
How many people?
About 1,000 have come through.
1,000 people?
1,000 people of groups that people in groups that we have either hosted, or we have helped the host court, or we've helped the court host, or we have spoken to when they've been there in the courthouse to talk about what we do. And so we do a lot of that and enjoy doing that. We have had people from as far away as Australia to come visit the courthouse.
Now they plan it before they come. You know they're coming.
They do. They
They'll
do.
just show up at the federal courthouse.
So it is a working federal courthouse. So we try to schedule them with an appointment, and we try to talk to them about what they want to see.
Who do they call to get an appointment?
They come to our website, thejohnsoninstitute.org.
What is some of the different groups like this year? Give me an example of a group that would come. The top 4 or 5, the biggest size groups.
Sure. So back in January, we had Leadership Montgomery come through. They brought their class. For the last several years, Leadership Alabama has come through in the fall with its class. We have had the Faith and Politics. The court has hosted in 2020 and then again this year. That's the big group that was founded by Representative John Lewis from down there in Troy.
Yeah.
They came through in 2020. It was a bigger crowd. It was about 45 members of Congress, including then Representative Lewis. They came back this year and had a good size
Now, what
group.
was the name of the group John was in?
The Faith and Politics
Okay.
Institute. And they bring members of Congress to Alabama every spring.
Every spring they come down here.
Every spring. So they come to Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma. And we've had them at the courthouse twice. We've had a number of teachers come through in student groups. We've had students from as far south as Daphne and as far north as Florence come and visit the courthouse, ranging from 4th grade all the way through law school students. They come and want to learn about Judge Johnson. They want to learn about the civil rights history that took place there in that building. And that's really why we were started, is because of the events that took place there in what is now the Frank Johnson Courthouse. That building is a site on the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, which leads to a lot of interest from folks who are coming to visit sites in Montgomery. It's also a National Historic Landmark. That is the site. The courtroom that is still a working courtroom is where Browder versus Gale was decided that desegregated buses back in 1956. That was where the Selma March was authorized in 1965. And all the cases that desegregated public parks and libraries and schools took place there in what has come to be known as America's courtroom.
Now, you'll meet them. Are you the one that does the tour every time? All those groups you did.
I have. So the Johnson Institute has a staff of 4 now. So sometimes I'm doing the tours. We have a education coordinator who makes the arrangements. We have an administrative person, and then we have a development person as well.
Well, now, y'all will meet them. How long does a tour last? About 2 hours?
Depends on what they want to do. So we will have groups that will come through and be there for about 45 minutes to an hour if they're visiting several sites around Montgomery. If they want to come in and we can line up one of the judges to speak to a group, they may be there for an hour and a half or 2 hours for a whole visit. We also do mock hearings. We'll do workshops with students and others who want to learn more about the judiciary. And that whole thing takes about 3 hours. So it just depends on what the group wants to do, what they want to learn about. We found that groups typically want to learn about, some groups want to learn about the civil rights history, some groups want to learn about the legal side of things, about the judiciary, and we will try to tailor a visit based on what their interest is in. The other thing we do in the summer, we host what we call the Scholars Conferences, the Johnson Institute Scholars, and we bring in middle and high school teachers for multi-day conferences to learn about the Constitution, to learn about the historic cases that were decided there.
Mostly Alabamians, or they all over the country?
Mostly Alabamians, but we've had teachers from Maryland and Ohio, and we had several from Georgia and Florida this summer.
They come just for a seminar,
Right.
for them individually to learn more about the Frank Johnson.
So they are some civics teachers, government teachers, history teachers who come and they want to use, they want to learn more about the court, and we help them to take the cases that were decided there in the courthouse and use those in their classroom as a means of teaching about the Constitution with their students.
Well, now, tell me this. Is there a archive area that's Frank Johnson's Institute, and you have like videos of him or all his papers, and tell me what all
So
is there.
all of his,
I've not seen it.
Well, all of his papers were sent to Washington. They're in the National Archives. So there are some papers that are still here in Montgomery in what's called the Johnson Library, the Frank Johnson Library that the court set up probably about 10 years ago, and they have several things in there, including his Presidential Medal of Freedom that was given to him in 1995. The court is working on expanding the archives that are there and finding some other documents that to include in that. So when we bring groups through, we teach them about the judiciary and talk about the federal court system, and then talk about the history that took place there. And if it's available, we take them into the courtroom that was Judge Johnson's courtroom.
Is there a video that they see of Johnson or anything?
We have several.
Do you have pictures of him actually talking and everything?
We do. There are two great interviews with Judge Johnson, and depending on the group, depending on what they want to see, we'll use clips from those interviews. Judge Watkins has a great presentation that he does with our teachers in the summer, where he walks through the historic cases that the teachers are learning about, and then we'll turn to a clip of Judge Johnson actually talking about those cases, which is a lot of fun. So just for reference, Judge Johnson died in 1999, so he is not around, but we've got these videos that can show him talking about these cases.
What do you think was his most famous case?
So the two in the civil rights era that stand out the most are Browder versus Gale, which was 1956. That was the case that came out of the events of the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks was arrested in December 1955, right outside this building. And then in February 1956, Fred Gray and others filed Browder versus Gale. That was the case that challenged the constitutionality of Montgomery's city bus segregation. Oddly enough, Rosa Parks was not a plaintiff in that case. That was the decision that Attorney Gray made and others because her case was tied up in state courts, and they decided to leave her off the federal lawsuit, but it's often known as the case of Rosa Parks. and it was decided there, and then was upheld. Judge Johnson, as part of a 3-judge panel with Judge Richard Reeves from here in Montgomery, decided that city bus segregation was unconstitutional. That was based on the Brown v. Board ruling that had come out a year or two before, and then that ruling was upheld by the Supreme Court later that year in December. And then probably the other one that was probably the most famous was the case of Williams versus Wallace, and the case is not known. The case name is not known as well as the events that it led to, and that was the Selma March in 1965. So after Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the marchers filed a lawsuit, Hosea Williams and John Lewis and others, against then Governor George Wallace. And it was heard in Judge Johnson's courtroom in March of 1965 before Judge Johnson issued an opinion that authorized that march to take place along the federal highway from Selma all the way in here to Montgomery.
So the Selma Montgomery March and the Broward Gale, which was the Rosa Parks thing, were his two considered his most.
Probably so. The other case that comes to mind, though, is one that was later after the Civil Rights era. In the 1970s, he had several cases that dealt with mental illness and prisoner conditions.
Right, exactly.
And so there was a case called Wyatt v. Stickney that you may be familiar with. It was famous in Alabama, but it was a case dealing with Bryce and Partlow Hospital up in Tuscaloosa, and that case set standards of care for the mentally ill who were being committed against their will for the first time in history. It upheld their human rights, and that case came out of this courtroom in Montgomery, and if you go anywhere in the world to this day and speak to someone who works in the field of psychology and ask them about the Wyatt standards, they'll be familiar with the Wyatt standards, and that happened right here in Montgomery.
Well, did Judge Johnson himself set those standards specifically, or he got a mental health expert to help him with that?
He had lots of experts that were dealing with that, and then the standards were in his order.
Okay, so he didn't know enough about the details of mental health to write. He took mental health specialist advice on what the standards would be and that sort of thing. Right. That's pretty normal protocol.
I believe so.
The federal judge can't know the details of mental health illnesses and that sort of thing.
Well, and they had, that case lasted decades, but those first orders came out in the early 70s.
You know, Thomas, Keith and I, Judge Watkins and I saw the civil rights thing unfold.
Really?
Yeah, we watched for Judge Johnson. And the South, in all honesty, in South Alabama, where Keith and I lived, in Troy and Pike County in this area, it was a segregationist thing. That's why George Wallace was so popular. Sure. But and everybody would just cuss Frank Johnson. So it's really bold of Keith and his time of his life to. He was really the spearhead of that thing, wasn't he? Because he always worshipped Frank Johnson. But Keith's a very conservative person politically. He was appointed by a Republican president. He's a Republican probably, but he really did worship Judge Johnson. And he hierarchically he's in Johnson's seat, is he not? Oh no, he's not.
I think that maybe Judge Marks is in. Judge Emily Marks is in Judge Johnson's seat, if I remember correctly. But you know, the interesting thing about Judge Johnson history, it was that he was not from Montgomery.
Oh, I knew. I was going to give you the history of it. I don't know if that's what I was going to ask you. Do y'all get into the history?
Absolutely.
Because his life epitomizes that area of Alabama.
Right. Right.
You see, when we were 75 years ago, there were no Republicans in Alabama except in Winston County.
Except in Winston County.
And his daddy was a Republican probate judge of Winston County. And I bet you Frank Johnson assumed that he would go back to Winston County and practice law in that county. And his demeanor and his frankness, he was a very frank man and very plain spoken and very you couldn't understand, when he questioned about where he stood. The people who came from that county, that was their heritage.
That's right.
You could almost see that in the Winston County independence.
Right.
As you know, when they seceded from Alabama, when Alabama seceded from the Union.
Right, right.
And his ancestors had been some of those same people who had seceded from the Union, Alabama, and didn't want a part of the Civil War.
That's
there were no
right.
slaves in Winston County.
Rocky Hill country
Uh-huh.
didn't have plantations like
No.
down here in this part of the state.
And the Black Belt controlled the politics of the
Right.
state for years and years. But Judge Johnson, you know the story of how he and Wallace really were friends in law school.
I know a little bit about
Well,
it. Yeah.
here's the thing. Frank Johnson's wife, he married, and he was in law school at the same time with Wallace. And Wallace, all of them were poor country boys, didn't have any money. But Frank Johnson had married a lady named Ruth, and she was renowned for being a great cook. And so it was a real honor for Frank Johnson to invite somebody over for supper because they got a home-cooked meal. And so Frank Johnson and Wallace really were friends from law school. Frank Johnson had invited Wallace over for supper to enjoy Miss Ruth's cooking when he was a law student. And he'd partaken of their food and their friendship for years. And really and truly, when you get down to it, politically speaking, a bigger, probably not as big as this nation, but he and Wallace tangled early on over the voting rights list in Barber County.
That's right.
See,
That's right.
Frank
And he was
Johnson says, I mean, they'd gone to law school together, and Wallace was a circuit judge down in Barber County, and he refused. He was trying to get publicity on the segregation civil rights issue. He said, I'm not going to give that scallywagging, carpetbagging liberal Frank Johnson these voting rights things. And he called Frank Johnson a lying, carpetbagging, scallywagging, liberal federal judge.
Yep.
Did you know that?
I did, and he was pretty rough on Judge Johnson on the campaign trail.
He'd run against him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wallace was he told me one time, he said, you got to find you a boogeyman to run against. He said, you got to run, he said, more people vote against somebody than vote for them. He said that more people vote against somebody, so you got to find you a boogeyman and run against him. Build up somebody that you know they all hate. And everybody hated integration. And Frank Johnson almost single-handedly integrated Alabama.
Yeah.
I mean, he really did.
Right. You know, one of the things that Judge Watkins talks about when he speaks is that Montgomery is finally claiming what it's always owned. Here is the birthplace of the civil rights movement. With because if you look at Judge Johnson, and we like to point this out when groups come through, and the court had recognized this before the institute existed. It was pretty remarkable that in the same time in the same place you had Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Judge Frank Johnson, because in the three of them you had a moral leader and an activist in Martin Luther King, you had a citizen who wanted to be treated with dignity in Rosa Parks, and then you had a judge who to uphold the Constitution and the backbone to uphold the Constitution in Judge Johnson. And think about how different the world would have been if those three people didn't live in the same, here in Montgomery at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I know it. You're right. And he was a stern guy. He ran a tight courtroom too. One summer I had a job they would let students, Bill Dickinson was our congressman, and he got a plush thing where you could have students in college who would be U.S. Marshals for the summer. I got to work as a U.S. Marshal, but I really got to watch court, and I watched Judge Johnson and Judge Varner's court one summer as a student U.S. Marshal. It was a great political job, sometimes I go out and travel with the marshals when they would deliver papers and subpoenas and things like that. But I got to mostly watch Judge Varner and Judge Johnson. Judge Johnson ran a tight courtroom. Do y'all pick that up on his protocol? He was stern in court.
Yeah. There are stories, and I don't know him well enough to repeat, but stories about attorneys who would just be terrified to practice in front of Judge Johnson, that they would stand up at the podium and pass out.
Oh.
You know, all kinds of stories about that. And Judge Johnson looking down over his glasses at people when they were standing at the podium. So it was very tough. Did you get to spend much time? Did you spend any time talking to Judge Johnson?
I never got to know him. He was a little bit of a aloof person. He'd gone through so much. I don't know whether he was a private person anyway, but I didn't know of him ever having much of a social life or spending any time chatting with people. He came to court and went back home to his wife and ate supper and gave out his room. Now you won't believe what those guys went through in that era, though. He got
Oh, yeah.
bombs thrown at his house at night. He didn't know. I never knew exactly. I bet he had to have federal protection at night.
For years, 24/7 protection for years from marshals. Yeah, his mother's home, and it was bombed here in
He had brought her to Montgomery.
Right, and so and he was Frank Johnson Jr. and the home was under his father's name, and so people thought they were bombing his house. She was unharmed, but it was a close call. He had a cross burned on his lawn, and yeah, had that protection from U.S. Marshals for years.
With those marshals, they wouldn't just be obvious outside his house, would they? They're sitting
You know, I don't
cars
know.
away,
I
or do
don't
you
know.
know?
I don't know how they probably made it clear that they were there. I suspect that helped to keep folks away if needed, but I don't know.
Yeah, that you knew that Winston County history, didn't you?
It's a lot of people say that had that his upbringing in Winston County had a serious influence on his outlook on the world. You know, up there in Rocky Hill country and with a strong individualist spirit and strong respect for human dignity. People think that played a role when he came down to Montgomery. And you know, we've got in the courthouse 2 editorials from the Montgomery Advertiser. One is from 1955 when he was being considered to be appointed to the federal bench here. And it talks about how Montgomery doesn't want somebody from the north thrust upon them down here in the southern part of the state. And then the other editorial is from 1999, right after he died. Same newspaper. And it just idolizes him and talks about what an incredible
I bet
person
Grover
he was.
Hall was the editor of the Montgomery
It's just
Advertiser in 1955.
an incredible change.
How much Montgomery's changed?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you know, Montgomery has changed, and it's a different city than when Keith and I were growing up. But Montgomery's always been a very racially polarized city, and it goes back to years and years. Do you know, when you're talking about, I don't know if you know this history of Montgomery or not, but this is way, way prior, before civil rights, before black citizens had the right to vote. Back in the old days, there were 2 families here that controlled the Hills and the Gunners, controlled politics in Montgomery, and they were like machines. And people would come to them in a mayor's race. It'd be the Hill legacy versus the Gunner legacy. And I had a relative who was my mom's distant cousin named George Grant, who was a congressman from the 2nd District from 1938 to 1964. He preceded Bill Dickinson. He was a Democrat, and everybody was a Democrat back then. And he lost in the Goldwater landslide in '64 to Bill Dickinson, a Republican. But he won that congressional race because the district was really just Montgomery, was most 80% of the district, but it went down and got Troy and Andalusia. Pike and Covington were in that district, and to the Florida line, and they couldn't pick a Montgomery candidate because they'd split, but they went down and got him out of Troy. He was a Troy lawyer, and matter of fact, the firm Keith came out of has its roots in the same firm that George Grant came from in Troy. Old man Ewell Orm had that firm, and he was in practice with George Grant in Troy as a Troy lawyer, but he was backed by the Hill machine. Lister Hill had gone to Congress from 26 to 38, then went to the U.S. Senate. Lister Hill, who was our famous U.S. Senator,
right.
And Grant followed him in that seat.
That's amazing. You know, one of the things that we are working on at the Johnson Institute is collecting oral histories of people who either knew Judge Johnson or were affected by his rulings. We've got some great.
You better hurry up and get them because they ain't gonna be here.
That's what we're working on. We've got some great interviews, some with historians talking about Montgomery's history and the history behind a lot of the civil rights activities and the legal side of that. We've got great interviews with family friends of Judge Johnson. And you know, you mentioned that he was a pretty private guy. I think that he had been pretty well ostracized from Montgomery.
Yeah, probably.
And he spent a lot of time.
This was a very, you know, raise his place.
Right. He spent a lot of time fishing, and
He loved fishing.
He loved to fish.
He was
and
known for that.
And he made fine furniture too.
I didn't know that, but I knew he loved to fish.
We have a grandfather clock in the courthouse that he made, and several people that I know here in town have shown me pictures and shown me furniture that he made for them, chest of drawers and other things. It's fun to see that type of stuff.
I don't think he and Ruth had any natural born children. I think Johnny, his son, was adopted.
That's correct.
He had an adopted son named Johnny, who I knew,
Yeah.
who worked for Bill Baxley. He wasn't a lawyer, but Baxley hired him. And he was a quiet guy like his daddy. But
Right.
no telling what that boy had been through, growing
Yeah.
up in a house where everybody gonna bomb your house, and you tell you were Frank Johnson's daddy.
He had a tough
that was
time.
a tough time. I don't think anybody can empathize with what Johnson went through
Yeah.
by doing what he did.
He had a tough time, and he of course died young.
Was it heart or what got him?
Suicide.
Johnny did.
Johnny,
Yeah,
yeah,
knew
yeah,
about Johnny. Yeah.
yeah. I think he had a really tough life.
Yeah.
And I think there is speculation that all the difficulties that Judge Johnson went through just doing his job probably contributed to making a pretty difficult atmosphere.
Did you know that story about Wallace eating supper at Ruth and Frank's house when they were law students? Had you heard that one?
I have heard several stories about them being friends. I understand they would go on double dates together. They knew each other, and I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Ruth taught Lurleen. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. It's funny how
Alabama's a
things
big
change.
front porch.
Yeah.
Is all it is.
Right.
I've always said that. Catherine Tucker Wyndham would say that, and I say it in my columns. It just ties people together. You know, it's a big tie together. It goes by in a hurry, Thomas. Our time's up.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Tell our folks
appreciate
again
it.
how if they want to get a tour, what they do. Just go online.
They can go to our website, which is thejohnsoninstitute.org, and if you do a Google search for the Judge Frank Johnson Institute, we'll come up there. And you can get our telephone number there. There's a form you can fill out to request a tour, and we would love to have people come through.
Well, we appreciate you taking time to be with us. Folks, our
Thank you for
guest tonight has been Thomas Raines, who is the Executive Director and Director of the Johnson Institute for Public Policy at the Federal Courthouse here in Montgomery. And we thank you viewers for watching. Hope you'll tune in again next week for Alabama Politics. Thank y'all.